now to I have a few questions for Kurt about the role of telecom. And Kurt, I kind of want to focus in a little bit on, you have over 20 years in this marketplace. You're considered a subject matter expert among your industry. Talk to me a little bit more about how telecom has evolved from where it was to where it is today right now.
Well, this is ultimately going to date me pretty fast, but back in the day, it was a heavy long distance market, and there was some old technology on the X.25 type days. It's all about covering this barrier or bridging this barrier of time and distance, and it evolved into convergence, and there was a necessity for taking video to everything you do, video conferencing to long distance services to other data type services, and converging those onto one network. So that's evolved all the way to the point now where it's like how we do everything is telecom and IT related, in my opinion. Social media to how you work, how you play, how you do everything daily is really tied to technology today.
I want to talk to you a little bit about life cycle management. That's a word we hear in our industry. LinkSource does do telecom life cycle management, but you're a very unique company. Share with us a little bit more detail what those words mean, life cycle management, in terms of what LinkSource does with your customers.
This is a term that I realize that is used quite a bit. We have a methodology that we utilize that's really been a proven methodology. We take a real holistic approach with our customers. Simply, we have 6 steps that we go through, and I wouldn't say that your customers just jump into step 1. They go into any one of those 6 steps, and it goes fairly deep from there. But the reality is when you follow the methodology that we have in these 6 steps, which really go from auditing to optimization and inventory to RFP management to contract management, project management, procurement management, and telecom expense management. When you follow these steps, there is a significant amount of efficiencies in optimization that comes with that, and there's also a significant amount of ROI that ends up coming with following that process. So for us, it's getting in there and understanding exactly everything you do as a company related to telecom, and then taking all that information and also putting it into an application, if you will, that will allow you to manage it moving forward. So you got to know where your contracts are. You need to know or have the right terms and conditions in those contracts. RFP management is another big challenge for companies. So we have a hosted application that we help run those RFPs, which we'll probably talk a little bit later in this segment.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into some details around that. One of the other questions I have for you. We live in this world now. It's called BYOD, bring your own device. And even today, all of us sitting here, we have phones, tablets, laptops, and even desktops. And no matter who you are, what government or organization you work for, chances are you have devices issued by your organization you're working for, as well as your own devices. Can you comment on the impact that BYOD is having on government as well as the telecom infrastructure?
The BYOD really came out hot over the last few years, and it really served the purpose of reducing costs and controlling costs. But it also created several other challenges in the business. At the end of the day, you ultimately can't tell an employee what to do with their own device, which forced companies to start looking at mobile device management solutions that really help them be more secure, if you will, with accessing the network. So, at the end of the day, it still presents a considerable amount of challenges because the security is still an issue. There's all kinds of interesting wireless access points becomes still quite the problem.
Stephanie, let me ask you to comment on that too, because in most infrastructures, whether you're a sheriff's department or you're the Department of Agriculture, chances are you've issued people that are out in the field a phone, a tablet, and computer. Can you comment a little bit on the impact that BYOD is having on on an enterprise infrastructure?
Certainly. BYOD has impacted the ability to get information, especially in government, out to the citizens in a quicker, easier manner. It's also enabled law enforcement, other types of oversight entities to have access to that critical information that they need sooner rather than later. What comes into play then is, how do you manage those? How do you secure them? How do you ensure that when they're lost or stolen, or even the data is being transmitted, that they are secure? So as Kurt said, the mobile device management comes into play. And with BYOD, you have to make sure, again, from a privacy and a security issue, that you have policies in place, that you're doing things correctly, that you're not creating undue liability for yourself or your company.
LinkSource works with companies globally, all over the country, and you work with a lot of teams where they're supporting, 40,000 devices plus, where a lot of times they'll just have a single individual monitoring that. Can you talk to me about the dangers that a company can have when you say you have maybe a couple people, one person, or no people at all managing the telecom spend?
Yeah, unfortunately, we see this a lot. That's a lot of devices for one or two people to have to manage, especially if you don't have the right tools in place to manage that many devices. There's quite a few things happening, and I would say some of the bigger things are really, there's some optimization challenges without having the time to really dive into what you can do better,
Right.
And how you can build better plans and manage those plans. It's very difficult to be proactive, and so in this environment, clearly it's a very reactive environment. And the one thing that you're just not going to see is, you're not going to see much of an ROI, even if you have an application in place, because at the end of the day, you have to have the right amount of folks involved managing that many devices.
Well, let me ask you a question. I know your company works in different verticals, from healthcare, finance, law enforcement. And my question for you is this: what if someone listening into our discussion today, they have 500 to 1,000 locations? So not only do you have multiple locations that you're trying to manage, you could have different regulations and different taxes being in different states. How, just kind of reiterating, what are the dangers there if you have one person managing a larger geographical print across the country?
It's very similar to what I said before. When it makes it that much more complex when you have multiple states involved that you're dealing with, because you are leaving significant savings on the table as it relates to tax potential savings. So again, as soon as you start breaking it out into different geographies, and even when you begin to go global, that presents all kinds of new set of problems and challenges.
LinkSource works in a variety of industries, such as public utilities, energy, healthcare, and law enforcement. How can the concept of mobile justice impact the cost of telecom to an organization? Could you share with us what are some of the pitfalls when a law enforcement agency is managing multiple devices, such as cell phones and tablets?
It all comes back down to some privacy issues, security, trying to manage a significant amount of devices and not having the right tools in place is going to put you back in that situation when you're not really taking advantage of any sort of optimization, and you're not driving any ROI. So a lot of the times you want to put yourself in a position you have the right tools in place to have avoid unnecessary costs. So, those are very typical challenges we see even in the enterprise space.
And I would also add in that I've had chief of police in large departments tell me, I don't have the money to issue an officer a cell phone, an iPad, or a tablet, plus all the security devices that go with it, the two-factor authentication tokens, all of that. So cost, again, is a big factor when you're talking mobile and mobile justice and multiple devices. And that's where I think LinkSource comes into play with being able to find those hidden costs, bring out the waste, and be able to drive those costs down so that you can afford the devices that you need to do your job.
You know, that's actually a really good point, and I'd like to elaborate a little bit as it relates to coming back a little bit to the audit and optimization and inventory, which is part of the 6 steps.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we have a very unique proprietary way that we go about doing auditing, and if we just look at wireless services, you have to have a specific skill set to not only create some optimization, but create some solutions going forward and manage those solutions going forward. If you look at what we've done over the last couple of years as a company in the audit space alone and optimization, we've saved customers over $1.6 billion on paper. So that's a fairly significant number to create some savings for customers.
I do have some questions around that number, and I want to come back to it. I want to, before we jump off this topic of the telecom life cycle, I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding of what that is. You know, traditionally you'll have either an organization is growing and they need lots of help building up, or they're established. But you know what LinkSource brings to the table is you have legal people, you have engineers, you have people that understand, you know, different legalities. You know, doing business in the Commonwealth of Virginia is very different than the state of California. Texas is different than Iowa. I mean, we understand these things. Could you comment and share with us a success story where you all have been able to come in and deal with a large organization, a particular vertical, where you've been able to help them manage this process with your team, like I said, of, you know, from technical procurement, some of the legalities with that? Please comment on that.
Yeah, you know, we see it both in companies that are growing and also companies that are downsizing. They have virtually the same needs. Where we've done a really, really good job, in my opinion, is we've been able to work with procurement teams as a strong team member. But because of our technical background and we help in the entire process of designing of networks, we're able to truly understand what's going on the technical side and help bridge that gap between procurement and the IT side. That has proven to be very, very successful over the years.
Before you get to that piece of it, where the engineers are coming in and understanding their growth, we're looking, you know, like you said, we talked a little bit about how telecom really is the next phase with security. How do you all begin to go in? You know, the term is independent validation and verification, or benchmark. How do you all go in and begin to do that process?
Well, the first thing that we do is we'll bring in our proprietary benchmarking services. And what that allows customers to do simply is, if we look at customer spend and let's say it's $5 million a month, with our benchmarking, we've been able to come in and be within 1% of future negotiated contracts. And your next question is probably going to give me some clarification, right? Give me some clarification. What does that mean?
Yeah.
And what that means is, when we've gone and negotiated those contracts based on what we discovered that was within that $5 million in spend, that perhaps we've given them some side-by-side comparisons and said you should be spending $3.5 million, for example. Well, we would go to our next stage, one of our next steps, and begin the process of negotiating the contracts. And when we were finished negotiating the contracts, we were within 1% of the actual rates that we did in the benchmarking. So it really allowed a lot of our customers to be able to budget quickly and efficiently in the beginning part of the process, before we even dove into any negotiations or future enhancements.
Wow, that is, I mean, I'm thinking just in terms of with any organization out there, if you're, and typically, you know, I think there's sometimes an assumption, oh, I'll just switch carriers and I'll get the new latest and greatest. But when people are looking at their spend and what they're doing, I mean, you're able to get into 1%. And typically, just for everyone listening, we're giving the example of a company spending out $5 million a month. Within that 1%, what I don't think we made clear is usually what you're able to come in and negotiate is significantly far less than what they were spending to begin with. So, you know, in this case, you know, correct me on this, but you know, if the math is, I'm spending $5 million a month, you all would come in and say, hey, you could probably be at 3 0.5 million a month, and you will negotiate in getting them within 1% of that.
Yes. And really, you know, at the end of the day, we don't go into our customers and say, hey, you know, let's change out your network, your primary network, from this carrier to this carrier.
Right.
That happens periodically.
Well, there's a big assumption with that. I just switch. You don't need to switch carriers.
No, it's not the approach really. At the end of the day, what we're trying to do is create some efficiencies and better understand our customer strategy. Where do you want to be for the next few years? And are you in a place to get there today based on, you know, what you have in place? So a lot of a lot of times what we're doing is we're talking to them about other technologies that could be coupled with their existing network, get their pricing in line, get their products and services in line, and then go ahead and actually drive down some additional costs because we're creating some optimization within the network. And there are several solutions out there now that actually allow that to happen for us.
About the future. We have a change coming up in the telecom industry. Probably many of the people listening in today are aware of it, but many of the traditional carriers that we've dealt with are getting out of the voice analog lines. Can you comment a little bit about this and, you know, what an organization needs to be aware of? Because it's certainly going to impact an organization. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we're talking about analog services and POTS lines. You read a lot about how the major carriers are looking at getting out of that particular business probably by, you know, 2020 and going into the 21st century with predominantly like an IP and wireless play. We get it. We understand it. However, in my opinion, that one, there's carriers that are already getting out of that business, and LECs, local exchange carriers across the country. Not all of them, for sure. I don't believe that most of the LECs today have the luxury where they can just get out of the business because they have to provide support and service for the next several years. Some may disagree with me, but from what we've seen, we see that there's still going to be some service being supported. However, the messages are very strong with what the largest carriers, you know, are looking to do over the next 3 or 4 years. And it's already happening at some level. You've already seen sort of the mentality of how they go about existing customer services and new business. So there are solutions. We're very well equipped to work with our customers today, to talk to them about options. We're doing, you know, alternative options today. And a lot of our customers are really kind of tipping their toe and trying some of these rebuild options that are out there and are very happy. So without having to uproot these services or potentially go down a technology migration to SIP, perhaps, which is Session Initiation Protocol, which is the big buzz that's out there. I believe that's probably where most enterprise customers will go over time, is go to that SIP technology, because we're handling quite a bit of that today. However, for the customers that want to have or retain the traditional POTS services, if you will, analog services, there are some really good options on the rebill.
Kurt, many of the traditional carriers are getting out of the analog voice business in the next 2 to 4 years. I'd like you to comment about what this change is going to be, and then Stephanie, I'd like you to chime in on it as well, because, you know, what does this mean to a government CIO, a telecom manager? You know, there's certain government organizations that still rely on analog service to inform their citizens about things. So Kurt, could you comment on the change that's happening in our industry in the next 2 to 4 years?
Sure. We see that the goal is by 2020, going into the 21st century, that a lot of the major carriers are looking to be much more of an IP and wireless play. We're seeing that there's a lot of voice services that are being turned down as we speak today, which means it's going to create all kinds of new competition, which we see, which is always good. And you know, with all the LECs, you know, across the country, not every LEC has the luxury to just turn off these services. And from my opinion, is they're probably going to be there to continue to support and service quite a bit of those customers for the next several years. That being said, I think that if you are reliant heavily on the POTS and analog services, there's plenty of messages out there. to start looking at other alternative options. And that is what we've been really good at, is presenting to our customers of several different options that are out there. One is probably the least intrusive, is a rebuild options, which is a lot of new competition coming in the market. Some do it very well, some not so well. But we've had a lot of success around migrating customers just from a pure billing perspective, and it's allowed us to take other carrier services and actually run it under those rebillers and create a single invoice, which has been nice. That's been very successful. When we look at other options, it really comes down to technology options. Most of the conversations we're having today are customers looking to migrate to SIP, which is a Session Initiation Protocol. And that needs some strategy behind it, but we're seeing and having more of those conversations today than most. And we also see, based on the capabilities, there's fiber that becomes a really big opportunity based on the way a customer's business is set up and how needy it is.
So you almost have, for anyone out there listening in today, you have two scenarios coming up. Scenario one is you invest in a newer technology. Scenario two is you're going to have these new analog carriers that you're going to have to go and negotiate with. So, Stephanie, you've led several large public sector organizations from both from a security and technology standpoint. What, as someone listening in today that manages a large organization that's heavily reliant on either a public exchange or analog lines in their service to the citizen, what advice would you have for them?
I would reiterate basically what Kurt said, Jimmy. You have to have a strategy in place, you have to plan it, and most importantly, you have to think security. Government went in the last several years to a lot of voice over IP projects. Some of them were successful, some of them weren't. The ones that were successful were well planned, strategized. It included your security team. It included your legal team to discuss privacy issues, the way that those things needed to be secured for the implementation. So again, security is very critical with the strategy discussions happening.
Kurt, talk a little bit about, whenever there's a change, new competition comes out. So if someone's going to continue with their analog line, say, for their business, it makes sense to do that. Essentially, they're going to have multiple vendors and different folks that they have to negotiate through. Talk a little bit about the new analog carriers that are going to be out there competing for someone's business.
It's nice to see competition in the market. And anytime you have disruption, something to this magnitude, it's going to create all kinds of new potential competitors out there. Again, I don't know the exact number of how many providers that are out there that can handle the rebuilding side of it, but I can tell you all the ones that we have looked at, some are good and some are not so good, and they have a long ways to go before they start truly creating a very smooth transition for customers and a better experience. But I will say that there are some very good providers out there that not only just help in the transition from a rebuild perspective on the POTS and the analog lines, but there's the ability to also include other carrier services that helps create a lot of efficiency just around a single bill with multiple products and services under it. So I think that it's a growing market on the rebuild side.
Talk to me a little bit how your clients are getting ready to transition. I realize we can't name them or talk in detail, but in general, someone's listening and they're like, okay, I probably need to get my transition strategy. What are some pointers you could give someone as they're getting ready to, prepare for this change in the next 2 to 4 years?
Good question. And it's, again, this is something that we do all the time. But my recommendation is you sit with a company that has the capabilities and skill set, like a LinkSource, and get a clear understanding of where the market's going with certain products and services and technology. Understand, meaning the company like LinkSource, understand the strategy that the customer helps or has, and help guide the customer down a path related to your telecom and voice services. So a lot of it really is sitting down, a lot of whiteboarding, and talking about where do you want to be over the next 3 years type of thing.
Next question. It's a little bit of a longer one. I'm going to take a second here to read it. But I happen to know that you all work with many C-level executives throughout the country, and you've easily reduced their telecom spend by 20%. With government leaders having the same objective, I can't tell you how many government people I interview, and they say, Jimmy, what I want to hear most about is how to reduce my spend and apply the savings. When they're able to realize significant savings, these savings then can be reallocated or applied elsewhere to improve service to an organization. So could you comment on this? 20% is significant. Could you talk a little bit about how you all have gone in and helped an organization find savings, then apply it for something else?
Yeah, I would say some of our most successful engagements is definitely because we have C-level support. And we understand exactly what the C-level is looking for in terms of an ROI at the end of the day and what that means to their business. So we've got our objectives clearly laid out. The challenge is when you don't have a C-level involved, sometimes we're only working with a single division within a company. And the value is really, we may start there, but the value is really to look at the entire business, the entire enterprise. And when we can do that, then we can create a lot more efficiencies, a lot more optimization. We can create a lot more savings when we can take an entire look at the entire enterprise.
And I think the goal, whether you're a telecom provider, you're a products provider, hardware, software, is you want to sell product. You want to sell services. You want to sell solutions to your customers. It's what you're incentivized to do. It's how your business maintains and grows. And essentially, you all eliminate the need for an organization to know all the rules of the game, because you know the rules of the game and can guide them through those kinds of things. One of the questions I have, do you all typically fund yourself through the savings, or how does that work? If someone's able to save so much, it probably pays for any kind of service that LinkSource would do for them.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. And I would say the first thing when we do sit with a customer, we really try to get them to take a step back and let's not worry about the carrier. Let's talk about the solutions, let's talk about the technology, and let's talk about the strategy. From there, we'll start to plug in the right suppliers at the end of the day. As it relates to paying for ourselves, yeah, we have yet to have an engagement where we didn't pay for ourselves significantly, 3-10 times over type of thing. And it really depends on the environment. But when we come in and we go through our full life cycle management, and when we implement a telecom expense management solution to help manage all the hard work that we just cleaned up with the customer, then we see that at that point it's all about cost avoidance and maintaining all the hard work and the cleanup that we just went through. And without a doubt, we've had a return on investment that is far supersedes what our costs are.
Excellent. I want to switch gears a little bit, and I want to kind of get behind the scenes of when someone actually plans to go out and do a procurement, do a spend. At a federal level, we call this capital planning investment control, CIPIC. States have different terms, but basically, whether it's a private organization or a government entity, you go into a planning mode where you're going to have to plan, buy, procure, and it's a very significant process. You put out an RFP, you have to wait the vendors come in and ultimately make a decision that's best, in private sector for your customers, government for your citizens. Talk to me a little bit. I know we've touched on how LinkSource Technologies works with the telecom lifecycle management, but you also go back and help organizations with the requirements and planning of a procurement. Talk a little bit about that for me.
Absolutely. That's basically the second step in our 6 steps for lifecycle management. And we've built an application over the last several years that's pending a patent right now that is called Direct RFP, and it runs all the RFPs. We provide a lot of the intellectual property, which is a lot of the questions for several different products and services related to telecom and security. Or we can take an existing RFP that you might have and you've already created, and we'll upload it into the system. It's been a huge differentiator for us as a company as it relates to potential competition. Mm-hmm. And we don't charge customers for it, because once you're a customer of LinkSource, you get access to our tools and resources. We build that into the process. And this system is, it's been very unique. So when we are running RFPs, it automates the entire process, has a 100% audit trail, has some scoring that's built into it. It also is a win for the vendors, and what I mean by that is nobody really likes to do RFPs at the end of the day. Nor do they like to repeat them on a regular basis. And what our system does is it does retain all the vendor responses, and it archives everything. So when a vendor participates in another RFP with the same question's been answered before, they'll see their default response and attachments. So they never have to repeat the same question twice when doing RFPs with LinkSource.
Let me know if I've got this right. I kind of want to paint a picture for our audience listening in. So we have procurement on one hand. That's, procurement goes out and finds the best of what they're told. We have technical on this other hand where they're giving the requirements for procurement. But in a sense, LinkSource Technologies is a bridge between those two organizations. I think, in government speak, it's a COTAR, Contracting Officer's Technical Rep, but essentially you can take the technical, translate it to the procurement, do the procurement, and ultimately help that client get the best possible purchase for their telecom and security requirements. Is that what I'm hearing?
That's exactly what we do. We really do try to help bridge that gap, and we've done it successfully with several companies. We become part of the team, whether it's on the IT side with all our technical folks to the procurement side and supporting their efforts and helping them create some more efficiencies. And by taking the RFP system and understanding what the procurement team needs to go through and the information that they need to having to deal with legal, we bridge all those gaps, and we've been doing it for several years successfully.
So you all could really work in the governance of any organization or planning out their requirements. At the very beginning stages, LinkSource Technologies could come in and help them understand how to do that.
Correct.
Absolutely.
Stephanie, your impressive career in government spans over 20 years in service to the state of California, as well as collaborating with other federal, state, and organizations. I'm going to ask you in a moment to comment on the evolution of security in government from when you began your career to where it is now. And I want to talk about the idea of, a lot of times we've seen in our world where an old technology is made new. But before we do that, I just want to highlight for our audience listening in, Stephanie's last post was at the California Department of Justice as Chief of Security. She also worked for CalPERS, State Controller's Office, and the Board of Equalization. Among her accolades, she was the founder of the California Interagency Security Group. She's been a pioneer in state privacy security. She's the founding member and current advisory board member of the Sacramento chapter of InfraGard. She is a work group contributor and representative for the California in the rewrite of IRS Publication 1075. This is tax information security guidelines for the federal, state, and local agency safeguards for protecting their tax information. I think, as many of us are aware, a lot of those things have been breached over the year. Stephanie also is a member of the Privacy Work Group with two other California tax entities in the IRS. She's a security expert and panelist on national forums for security and privacy. She's a member of the CLEAT Strategic Planning Group. She's a security expert and speaker on CGIS, security requirements. She's also a speaker for the State Cyber Symposium. So, for anyone listening in today, what that means to you, this is someone that works not only here in the state of California. She's worked with many of our border states. She's worked across the country and is working on many federal mandates that are going to get passed down on privacy and security. So with that, I'm going to bounce it back over to you. Talk to me a little bit, on the evolution of security. And, along that lines, we're seeing a lot of the old things made new. Comment on that for me.
Certainly. Back when I started into security in the mid-90s, PCs were being introduced into the workplace to replace basically dumb terminals.
Right.
All of us remember playing games, playing solitaire at the time to learn.
I will do that.
Yes, to learn how to operate the mouse and use the PC.
Even going to Windows school, which is now taught in 3rd and 4th grade. But I remember as a young executive, we had to go and learn, hey, click here, do this. This is how Windows works. It was a huge change in our world.
Absolutely. And those of us that had taken typewriting, dating us back even further, had a little bit more of advantage with the keyboard, where it seems to be second nature today to kids. But again, you know, at that point, security was evolving. We didn't have a lot of employees that were connected to the internet. In fact, back in the day, you had to receive special approval to be internet connected. So our big things were antivirus, which was in its infancy. We used multiple antiviruses because one company couldn't contain everything. So you had different antivirus at the desktop, the server level, and various places in the network. And from that, our biggest concern was, again, content filtering.
Right.
We didn't want our employees going to inappropriate sites because we didn't want to make anyone's top 10 list at the time for inappropriate content or misuse of public funds by going to inappropriate places. Right. So from there we evolved into more emerging technologies. We saw firewalls beginning to expand into being able to do different things. We saw the emergence of malware and companies coming out to combat malware. The biggest things we saw in the network area were the layering. We moved from flat networks to layered, tiered architecture. We saw security move from the network group, which had been primarily access controls and privilege management, along with settings on firewalls, network configurations, to actually a security team. You saw the emergence of information security officers, and sometimes it was them and their team of them, and then you began to have other staff. And so security actually became its own entity.
Well, and for the longest time, you would have just chief information officer. Everything was under that person's umbrella, and really, you know, what a chief information officer does is very different than what a chief information security officer should be doing.
Absolutely. And we saw the emergence of breaking away the chief information security officer from the CIO into more of a bridge between the executive group and the business group and the IT group. We've seen it circle back in other places. In California state government, we saw it roll back under the CIO. So there has been a lot of change. Lately, the biggest words that we hear out there are the advanced persistent threats, the APTs, the malicious code. We've moved into not just malware and phishing attacks and social engineering, no longer concerned about the early days of phone phreaking. If you ask a kid that today, they probably have no idea what you're talking about. Into managed attacks, DDoS attacks,
Right.
voice over IP attacks, all of those types of things. And we've seen some of these traditional appliances, security, firewalls.
Well, even this summer, a lot of the universities around the country, there was the DDoS for Bitcoin, DDoS BC, where they were getting held ransom if they didn't fix things that were wrong with their security. They were going to get shut down, or they had to pay the Bitcoin ransom. And you know, just even recently here in our state, there was a situation with one of the city governments where that happened to them.
Yes, ransomware is a big concern these days. And again, you know, we've seen the evolution of all of this, and all of this, the attacks change, the threat actors change. It's no longer the curious kid
Right.
trying to go out there to see what they might be able to break into, but you see attacks from nation states, orchestrated
Absolutely.
attacks, hacktivists. Hacktivism is a big concern. You'll
Kind of,
see-
I mean, I think one of the most recent examples, when we look at the difficult situation that happened in Ferguson, Missouri, where last summer all of us followed that story. And anyone listening in, when you have any kind of social powder keg situation, whether it's a protest, whether it's a physical calamity where harm's brought, you could potentially have a powder keg on your hands. And yeah, and I think your point back, it's, as we've watched this evolution, it's not if you're going to get hacked, it's when. So, my question with all this, we talk about sometimes in our world, we've all been around a little while, and we've watched some things that are new, that are very new, but then we've seen that in our careers, but we've also seen some things that are old and are becoming new. How's that impacting the security world right now?
Those types of social events that trigger emotions in people, trigger concerns from nation states or social activist groups, they all play into the security concerns that most of us have, whether it be our identity that's being hacked or your services being taken offline. And with that, we've seen the appliances, the new next-gen softwares, old technology being made new. You're seeing basically a lot of the firewalls that are being touted as next-gen technology that are no longer just simply a firewall, but they also protect against content filtering, malicious code, etc. You're seeing all kinds of different things being changed. The original security as a service, managed service type of model that used to basically just monitor your network bandwidth, antivirus, content filtering, emerge into fully staffed security ops centers that have highly trained security analysts behind them working with you and your team, a lot of them with very high level security clearances. And so we've seen the change in some of these basic principles move into technology and technology services basically on steroids.
Okay. I have a question for you. I'm sitting in a leadership position and I want to make sure I'm secured. I don't want to be the guy on the front page of the daily paper that says I've been breached and this has happened. But just because you're adhering to compliance, and let me just, for folks listening in, we have compliance like NIST, COVID, PCI, HIPAA, GLBA, SOX, FIPS, ISO 2700. So we have a lot of things to be compliant to. My question for you, do those automatically guarantee that you're secure or safe if you're compliant?
That's a good question, and the short answer is absolutely not. Compliance does not equal security. Unfortunately, a lot of people think that it does. You will have an audit come out, your executives will think that if you adhere to the basic security standards and frameworks that you've mentioned, that you will be secure. And unfortunately, it doesn't equal security. You can have all of those things in place, and a change can be made to the network. Malicious code can come in through a phishing email, etc., and you are no longer in compliance, although from an audit perspective you may be. So again, the big misconception here is that a lot of times companies think that if they just do these things and they pass their audit, they are compliant, that they are secure. What those things do for you is help generate security funding, typically, and more money and dollars spent in your security program.
Okay.
I see a lot too where customers kind of just do the minimum expectation, and I think the bigger challenge and what's at risk is the integrity of your customers, and you look at the impact it has on your customer base and their business, could put you out of business. One breach.
I want to talk about that in a moment, about the cost of it and time to detect. But before we get there, let me ask you one other question. Last month, you participated in a panel called Hackers and the Human Factor. And it was, you were part of about a 9-person panel from all over the country, state local county government as well as higher education. And you all were talking about the human side to gaining access to a network. Share with our audience a little bit what you learned being on that panel of subject matter experts.
What I learned was that we all continue to struggle with security and keeping our environment secure. There is no magic bullet for security. That, again, it's a combination of due diligence, good security architecture, practices, highly trained and skilled staff, and continuous monitoring of your networks if you're internet facing.
Stephanie, I want to read this next question to you. Last August, the Harvard Business Review featured an article entitled, "They Burned the House Down." It was an interview with Michael Litton. Litton is the CEO of Sony Pictures Entertainment. The article discussed the attack by North Korea and the release of the film, The Interview. Litton stated, "The bigger challenge was that the folks who did this didn't just steal practically everything from the house, they burned the house down. They took our data, then they wiped stuff off our computers, and then they destroyed our servers and our computers." And for people listening in today, it's no longer a question of if you're going to get hacked, it's when that will happen. Could you comment a little bit about this article and what Linton was saying? Because, as I read this article, I think a lot of people don't think this basic level, but they had trouble making payroll, because you got to imagine if all of your information, just the way your organization breathes and thinks, you have an absence of your technology to be able to function. So could you comment a little bit about that article?
Sony was and is a classic example of a company that had a well thought out security team, sound architecture, state-of-the-art technology for security, and was still breached. They had business resumption plans and business continuity plans also. What they weren't prepared for was the attack that came through. Some say that it was a phishing email that was opened by an employee months ahead of the actual red skull appearing on their computer screens, warning that intellectual property and Sony secrets were about to be released. When that happened, it threw them into a state of no network. Their network wasn't just DDoS, but everything came down. They had no email. They had to revert to phone trees for telephone to communicate. They had intellectual property that was released out through social media and lost millions and millions of dollars. Their actual disaster recovery plan took time to be implemented. It wasn't well rehearsed, is my guess. And it took them days to bring things up and to try to get some semblance of business as quasi-normal. So had they had an early detection of that phishing email, that malicious code on the network, they may have been able to have reduced the footprint of the breach and continued normal business operations and not lost that intellectual property.
I have a question. I want to get into a little more details about their time to detect and how long, and the actual cost of that attack is staggering. But before we get there, we had talked about myself and Kurt. We had talked about this idea of a powder keg situation where something happens in our community that we're not planning for. It's a difficult situation, and it could be a private company, it could be a government organization, where you find yourself the target of every hacker, hacktivist, or cyber criminal in the world is, for a certain period of time, is going to be looking at your organization. So, the question for people, I think we've made clear, it's not a question of if, but when it's going to happen. What do you do to get ready for the when? I mean, it's coming. So what and you've had leadership roles with many large organizations. What do they do to begin to prepare and anticipating the next powder keg situation?
What they need to do is develop a good business resumption and business continuity plan.
Okay.
They need to make sure that they test it, that it is sound, that everyone is aware of the plan, that everyone knows what needs to happen if something were to go down. And with that, again, they need monitoring of the network.
I think that is really important is looking at partnering with a resource, a company like LinkSource who has the skill set, the background, like a Stephanie, to sit there and help you discover which technologies that you can leverage that are out there in this space.
Well, and the thing is, you don't want to be negotiating a contract, Saturday night when everyone's gone because something has happened, and getting prepared for that. And I think we live in this world now where it's, and I want to talk a little bit more about this in the interview, where it's really about the time to detect something and what the cost is on that. But back to the question that I was asking you is that we've watched it here in our own state of California. We've watched other situations like last year with Missouri. We've seen. We've even watched, private sector organizations like Home Depot have challenges, and Target. And so, the question that I wanted to kind of move back to a little bit is, we all know something like this can occur. So what do you get in place as we are, preparing? Because it's when a powder keg situation happens, it's about protecting your customers, serving your citizens, getting the right information to the right person at the right time. And, again, what are some of the preventive things that an organization can do? Not that you have a crystal ball for every situation, and I'm sure, Sony looks back and says, we could have done this, and that. What are the lessons learned from something like this for organizations listening to our...
Yeah, the biggest part of that is the communication, as Kurt said. The establishment of critical relationships are important to have those in place, whether they be with a company like ours, law enforcement, another technology company, your telecom provider, etc. Having those in place ahead of that disaster emergency, that downtime, will speed up the recovery time. Again, as you mentioned, the detection, the monitoring, knowing about those things ahead of time is critical in minimizing the risk.
Stephanie, my next question for you, and Kurt, I'd like you to chime in on this as well, is that a lot of security vendors are pitching the idea of a one-stop shop for all your security needs. Could you comment on that? I mean, the theory behind it's pretty good. You go through one vendor, it cuts down on your cost because they're supplying you everything, your training, they're there managing your account. But the security is so diverse. There's so many, nooks, crannies, tools, equipment, software, hardware. I'd like you to answer your feedback on the one-stop shop. And then Kurt, I'd like you to comment on that as well, and how that parlays into the telecom world. So Stephanie, could you kindly answer on that?
Certainly. The one-stop shop, as you said, it's good in concept, but unfortunately, most of the companies out there may specialize and have best in breed in one technology, but some of the other pieces of their portfolio may not actually be the best in breed.
How does that parlay into the telecom world, with a one-stop shop?
It resonates perfectly because salespeople sell you what they want to sell you. And one-stop shop, although to Stephanie's point, in the years and years ago, that was really the way to look at it, because you could drive the volume, which would drive discounts. That's not the case as much anymore. Volume's still important. However, with all the competitors in the business today, everybody is competitive. And if you want the one-stop shop, if you will, the way to look at it and the way our customers look at it is when you have a management company in place that manages your telecom and your security, we're that throat for you. So at the end of the day, to Stephanie's point, taking multiple providers that deliver a strong skill set, product, and service specifically in a certain area is what we try to focus on. Not one company does everything really well.
Well, no, and I think, like you said, ultimately a company is motivated to, grow itself, do its best, although they could be excellent products, but you really need sort of that unbiased observer that's kind of doing the, independent validation and verification, everything. Let me ask you a question. This is going to go to both of you. So I'm going to ask you this question first, and then I'm going to give you a version of it. So last month, here in Northern California, we had the RSA conference. For those of us in the security industry, this is one of the biggest, largest events. I mean, thousands upon thousands of vendors and people. You have a situation lining up where you have, you look, okay, someone makes the Gartner quadrant. That gives you a lot of security. I mean, excuse the pun there, but it gives you a lot of security in making your security choice. They've been vented, it looks good here, but there are also, as we know, throughout the world, there are some incredible technologies that may not have had the resources nor time to get in the quadrant. So my first question for you is, how do you determine, what is best? Because it may not always be the case that someone that makes the quadrant is the best, choice for you. And then, Kurt, back to you. We said earlier in the interview that, hey, your traditional analog carriers, they're going to be changing the game a little bit. So you're going to have some new vendors you have to choose from. So my question is to both for you is, how do you pick best of breed for what is actually what you really need?
Well, in the security space, you really need someone that knows security to vet through those products, because you may find someone, for instance, at the RSA conference that has the smallest booth in the far reaches of the hall, and they may have what is really the new and upcoming best of breed technology. So you need a security professional that knows how to vet those products to determine the differences, that doesn't get swayed by a good salesman with a bad product, right, and foresees and overlooks the good product with an engineer and not a salesperson talking to you. So again, at LinkSource, that's what we do. We vet those best of breeds in the security space for you. We make our recommendation based on your business need, and then we let the customer choose.
Okay. And on the telecom side, comment on that.
Very similar. At the end of the day, the only way for you to really know if it's going to be a good service is to experience it. So as a company, we go out of our way to actually go through a testing of several vendor services, especially in this space as companies are looking to make a potential move from to a rebiller. We put them through a process. There's a pretty significant checklist that we're looking for when we're testing out these services, all the way down to the accuracy of billing. So it all comes down to the experience. And if you haven't tried the service, and you're never going to know if the service is that good.
That's true.
So we go through a very, very vigorous process to make sure that we test all the suppliers that are out there that we come across.
We had talked about the attack on Sony. There's all kinds of different opinions of what that actually cost them, but one of the statistics I heard is that it was $15 million. When an attack happens, we've watched in our world, stores we shop up to, government agencies, all, federal, state, and local, all have issues. How costly can an attack be to an organization?
Well, as in the Sony case, it can be very costly. I believe the price tag was upwards of $15 million for just that entity alone. And the critical part of that is detecting that sooner. The statistical average for time of a breach to discovering that you've been attacked is over 200 days. And
wow.
Typically that will come not from your internal notification, but it's typically when law enforcement comes knocking at your door. It's posted out on social media, it's tweeted, or you receive an email, as in the
it's
case of
frightening.
Sony's.
It's 3/4 of the year almost, or I mean, a little bit less than that, but that's a huge amount of time.
Absolutely, it is. And when you have that large of a window of a breach, you then expand the records, the intellectual property, all of the information about your network that can be leaked over a period of time.
Interesting that, I've heard you speak a number of times, and you do an excellent job where where you talk about the security hack being the bread, the piece of proverbial bread, and then what you want to do is find the breadcrumbs. There's a theory right now in the marketplace that we hear a lot of our trade magazines where they talk about that the real focus of security should be time to detect and then time to contain. Could you talk about that in a little more detail as it relates to this kind of picture of the bread and the breadcrumbs?
Absolutely. Time to detect is, as you know, one of the latest concerns and kind of the buzz phrases that is going around, but it is very critical in minimizing the loss of data, your risk exposure. And to do that, that's the big question. How do you detect it sooner and contain it sooner? And in my opinion, what you need is eyes and ears on the network. You need highly trained security analysts that are looking at your network on a continuous basis 24/7, not those that are being dispersed out to meetings throughout the day, but you actually need somebody there. It's not just a piece of software either, because those generate a lot of false positives. But that highly trained security person that can take those breadcrumbs and piece them together and say, this looks like someone is laying the trail for an attack. And when you have that type of staffing, you can normally detect and contain it, minimize the risk, reduce your exposure, and the cost of the breach.
When you talk about the staff and certifications like that, I know there's always a dialogue between, a lot of times people leave public sector to go to private sector. Is it realistic to put together in a public organization a team that can do all that?
Unfortunately, it isn't. You may get someone that's young that has those skills. The type of skills I'm talking about are basically white hat hacker. Someone that can go in and not only look at your network logs and piece together things, but ask themselves the continuous question, and then what? And then what does this mean?
Right.
So that mindset isn't, and that skill set isn't easy to come by. It's in high demand. If you find someone in the public sector that has those skills, you may retain them for a little bit, but they're going to move on to something bigger and better. So the question then comes into play, how do we get them? We've tried to address this at the national level with training for children, doing cyber warrior drills and skills and trying to get kids interested in that. But again, you can train someone to hack, but not everyone has that hacker mindset. So that's the critical piece for me, is finding that. And in the public sector and even the private sector, they're hard to come by. So the next question would be, how do you do that? Well, if you can't hire them yourself, you look for someone that has them on staff, that has that ability, and partner with them, whether it be a managed service, another government entity, etc. But you need that type of skill set in order to detect and contain.
And the clearance as well, right?
Absolutely.
So clearance is pretty critical.
And there's an investment in being able to have a security, to be able to even work in certain agencies. So
Absolutely. And typically, if you find someone with those skill sets, you're not going to be able to afford them, or you may be able to afford one, but not two. And then the question becomes, how do I get continual coverage 24/7? And again, that may be where the answer is. Move to a good managed security service, outsource your security ops center.
My next question for you, next month you're going to be featured in a panel here in Sacramento, California with technology and security subject matter experts, and it's on the topic of security and visibility. I want you to comment for me on how do you begin to bring light to some of those hidden threats. You know, like anyone, if you have a security breach, you're going to look at the high vulnerability areas probably before you go out worry about the lower vulnerability area. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, a lot of companies will do a risk assessment, a penetration test, and they will look at those benchmarks in determining what they need to fix. And that's where you get your high, medium, and low vulnerabilities a lot of times. And typically when the executives see that, the CIOs see those reports, they immediately want their staff to fix those things that are high. And then they'll move on towards the medium. But oftentimes they discount or they never get to the low vulnerabilities. And in my mind, that could be a fatal flaw, particularly because hackers, if they're determined to get into your network, they usually lay those breadcrumbs that we discussed, those parts of an attack is well orchestrated and planned over a long period of time. And they may have the ability and the patience to go after those low risk vulnerabilities and invade you that way.
Oh yeah, I mean here we have, I think the latest number I read, we have California is the world's 8th largest economy. We have 37 million citizens and we have over 226,000 employees. So a lot of targets, you know, as you're beginning to look at that. And like you said, we've got to be keenly aware of, you know, the importance of a high threat area to making sure we're covering our bases on the low threat areas. My last question for you all as we get ready to wrap up this discussion is, there are a lot of managed service providers out there in the marketplace. You all have a unique skill set combining the telecom with the security, but I'd ask you, why LinkSource? Kurt?
I would say because of the people that are here. The skill set, the experience, these are all veterans. They are all very committed to the experience at the end of the day, but they're also committed to the knowledge, which is what we're doing here is we're providing knowledge to the customer and more importantly driving them ROI. We're very reliable and we're a very loyal company to work with on the management side.
Well, and I think it's been said that you all can take the complex and make it simple and help people navigate through a maze of laws, contracts, and really getting them, what's best of breed.
Absolutely, you're hired.
But I got a question for you. You were a chief of security. You had people knocking on your door. You understand the demands. I mean, the organizations that you were on top of these were not small agencies. These were very large entities. So, someone sitting out there as a CIO, a CISO, telecom manager, and they get a knock on the door and it's LinkSource. What is it that you would be able to offer them?
Again, going back to your example of the RSA conference, you have thousands of products and vendors out there. How do you determine that? Well, you don't have to. We do that for you. We look at that best of breed. We figure out what is truly a good best of breed security product in each of the spaces. And we present that to you after we determine what your need is.
Excellent, excellent. I'd like to thank both of you for joining me today. And for those of us joining in via the internet, thank you for your time. I'm James Baker. Make it a great day.